What's up, guys? Justin here with TheSketchUpEssentials.com. So in today's video, we're wrapping up our Getting Started in SketchUp 2025 series by learning how to create a realistic rendering using the new render feature. Let's go ahead and just jump into it. And so remember, if you do need additional help with any of this, you can definitely check out the SketchUp Essentials course, where I provide a little bit more feedback and actual live support and things like that. You can check that out at the link in the notes down below. But let's go ahead, and what we want to do is, up to this point, we've been focused on modeling. But in this video, we're going to focus on how you can use the rendering engine inside of 2025 in order to create a realistic rendered image. And so basically, the way that rendering works is, unlike this model right here, which is very flat at the moment, what rendering does is it takes light and it applies it to the model. And when it applies it to a model, what that's going to do is that's going to allow us to actually see things like reflections and other things like that inside of the scene. So it makes for a much more realistic image, especially if we have shadows enabled as well. And so in this video, I'm going to talk you through the basics of setting something like that up so that we can get more realistic, interesting lighting on our models in SketchUp. And so you can download this model and follow along in the 3D warehouse. It's called the Daily Coffee Shop with one E from Ramadan M. And so we're going to bring this in, and we're going to go ahead, we're going to set this up for rendering. And so the first thing we need to do is we need to toggle on realistic lighting. And so to do that, you can go into the Styles section of your tray. And if you don't see the Styles section of your tray, you can right-click in this box right here, go to Styles, and toggle that on, and you should see options over here. And specifically, we're looking for the option for Display Photoreal Materials. Note this was added in SketchUp 2025, so if you have an older version, that isn't going to show up. And so when we click on this, notice what this is going to do is it's going to give you a little pop-up telling you that we're going to activate photoreal materials. If we click on OK, what you're going to get is you're going to get an image in the background like this. And so this is how SketchUp lights images. It uses an environment file called an HDRI image. It's basically an image with lighting information associated with it. And so when you do this, it's going to swap out your background for an HDRI, and it's going to start lighting your model using that HDRI image. Now, we can find things about the HDRI image by going over into our tray and looking for the option for environments. For my Mac users right now, it's just a window called environments, and it's going to look something like this. So if you click on it, it's going to look like this. And so what this does is this gives you a section in here where you can pick different preset environments. Note there's also an option to create your own environment as well, which we're not going to get too far into in this video. I will link to a more in-depth video on rendering where we talk about that. But in this case, if we go to Edit, notice how we can adjust things about this environment right here. So for example, you can adjust your rotation. Now, when you adjust your rotation, notice the way that the scene is being lit is changing. That's because we're rotating the environment around the outside of this model. Now, one thing to know about HDRI environments is they all have different light based on the conditions of the environment when the image was taken. So if I go back into the select function right here and click on the farm option, notice how the lighting is significantly different than if I click on the sky at sea option right here. So that's going to be important because those are going to give you different looks. So you can pick environments here, you can edit environments here. Now, one thing you might have noticed in here is currently this is just kind of floating in space. And so we want to go ahead and we want to fix this so it doesn't look like we just have a flying model in 3D space. So to fix that, we're going to go into our Styles section under Edit, and we want to, within this current style that we have active, we want to toggle on a ground plane. And so when we toggle on a ground plane, what that's going to do is that's going to add a plane in here so that your model doesn't look like it's just floating in space. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to set the transparency to 0. Now, for this model, what we need to do is we need to go ahead and move it up a little bit. So you could probably do something like this right here so that the concrete is up above this ground plane. But now, if you were to toggle your shadows on, those would be cast on that ground plane. So now we have a ground plane in here, and let's go ahead and let's look at some of our environment settings. So in the case of this environment right here, notice how there's currently no sun set. And so the way an HDRI environment works is there's usually a bright point or a couple bright points in the scene which represent things like the sun. Well, if you check this box for set sun location, what should happen is SketchUp should come in here and try to find the brightest point in this scene and use it to set the sun. And so notice how when we did that, that also toggled shadows on. So now we're getting shadows cast in our scene as well as what the environment's doing right here. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to rotate this so that my environment's casting a little bit of shadow on my scene, and we're also able to get some reflections. And you can kind of see this here and you kind of can't, and that's okay. We're going to work on that in a second. But now what I want to do is I want to adjust the exposure of the sky dome background. So I'm going to bring this up like this, and notice how when I do that, that makes the background lighter. And I want to try to match the brightness of the background to the brightness of the actual scene right here. Now, if you ever want to not use this as a background, but you still want to use it for lighting, you can uncheck the option for use environment as sky dome. In this case, I'm going to go ahead and leave it checked. And the other thing I want to do is I want to make sure that my reflection brightness matches the brightness of the background as well. So notice how this adjusts the brightness of the sun that's being cast on your model, like this. And so I like this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to set up a scene where these settings are saved. So I'm going to go to View, Animation, Add Scene right here. And this is going to ask if I want to save this as a new style. In this case, I'm going to go ahead and say yes when I create the scene, like this. And so now I have my first scene in here. Now, if I was to toggle this back off, I could go back to shaded using textures like this, and then I won't have that lighting going on in the scene. So a lot of the time what I'll do is I'll create a scene in my SketchUp model that actually doesn't have that background set. So in this case, I'm going to toggle off use environment as sky dome right here, and I'm going to add a new scene. So I'm just going to right click and click on add. I'm going to save this as a new style as well, and then I'm going to move this to the left and I'm going to rename this. So this one is going to be working. This one is going to be render 1. And one of the things I like to do is I like to go ahead and set up a couple of these with a couple different setups, right? So in this case, this one, for example, I might not want the trees in the background here. So what I might do for this one is I might go ahead and set this up so that my sun is shining on my model like this. But for this one, I might toggle off use environment as sky dome right here. And I might go ahead and set this up because I like the lighting, but I didn't necessarily like what the background was doing. So I'll just call this render 2. And then a lot of the time I'll pick one with a lower sun because the lower sun is going to cast more dramatic shadows. And I'll go ahead and set the sun location on this one, set my rotation to be something like this for right now. And I'll go ahead and I'll add a scene and I'll call this render 3. And if you ever want to change these and update them, like for example, I might bring the exposure on this sky dome up, you can just right click and you can update the scene to update that. Well, now I have 3 views set up and ready for me to work with. And so now what we need to do is we need to go in here and we need to set up these materials so that they're more realistic. Because right now, everything is very flat, right? Especially with 3D warehouse models, most of these were created before PBR materials were ever added. And so what we need to do is we need to add a special kind of material that looks more realistic. And so to do that, we can go into our materials tab. I'm going to go ahead and update this scene with this closer in camera image. But what I want to do is instead of having this wood material, for example, I want to replace that with a wood material that's more realistic. So we can do that by clicking on the drop down right here and going into the wood section. And notice how there are some wood materials that are built in to this version of SketchUp right here. Now, at the moment, we can go ahead and we can mess around with this wood veneer, but there are other materials, and I'll show you how to download those in a minute. But for now, what I want to do is I want to double click this object, and I want to just apply this wood veneer to the faces, right? So I'm just activating this, clicking on the material right here, and I'm just going to apply this wood material to the faces. Well, one thing you're going to notice about this wood material, if you go into the Edit tab right here, is notice how this material has things called maps associated with it. And so what a map is it's basically an image file that contains information about the way that light should interact with this object. And so we've got things like the roughness. What the roughness does is it sets how reflective a material is, right? So a roughness value that's very high won't be very reflective. A roughness value that's very low is much more reflective, right? Notice how this starts getting a sheen on it right here. So I'm going to keep this roughness fairly high. Then there's the normal map. What the normal map does is it makes the material look bumpy. So notice how if I crank this all the way up to 5, I start getting these ridges in here on the material. That's because this has a map associated with it that says, okay, in these areas, make this material bumpy right here. Now, what we don't have is we don't have an ambient occlusion map or a metalness map. And so let's talk about the metalness map real quick. And so what a metalness map does is it sets if a material is metallic or not. Well, in the case of like these objects right here, these would be metal. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select this, I'm going to pick this material, and I'm going to go into Edit, and I'm going to bring the metalness up, right? So I'm going to bring the metalness up right here, and I might bring the roughness down if I want this to be a little bit more reflective as well. And I want to do that for the metals in my scene, because what happens when you get the metals in your scene like this is you start getting those kind of like metallic reflections in here. This version of SketchUp actually does really well with the metals, probably a lot better than other materials. So I'm just going to go through and pick the metal things really quick. I'm going to make the metal, bring the roughness down a little bit like this. So now I've got a material on here that kind of reflects, and I've got some brick. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a quick way to swap out materials inside of your SketchUp model so that you can do this really quickly. And so what I want to do is I want to create just a little box. So I'm just going to draw a rectangle right here, and I'm going to push-pull this up just a little bit so that I have a surface on here. And what I do a lot when I'm working with 3D warehouse models is I actually use an extension from TomTom called Material Replacer. So what that does is that allows me to select a material and completely replace it in my model with another material. So to find that, we can go into the extension warehouse, and you want to look for Material Replacer. And you want to look for this extension right here, and you want to install it. Now, before you do that, notice how this needs another material called TT_LIB. That's TomTom's library. So you just want to go to TT_LIB, and you want to make sure you install this extension before you install Material Replacer right here. And so you want to make sure that you've installed both in your SketchUp model. But once you do that, there's going to be an option under Tools for Material Replacer. And so in this case, I want a different wood material, but I don't like any of the materials in the built-in SketchUp library. Well, what you can do is you can click on this option right here to launch the 3D warehouse. And we're going to go ahead and we're going to look for SketchUp Wood Collection. And notice how there's a lot of additional woods in here that you can use. So I'm hoping in the future they're going to improve the previews in here, because it's kind of hard to look at these and see what the materials are going to be. But in this situation, I think that we could probably use this wood planks right here. So I'm just going to download this material into my model, and I'm going to apply it to this surface. Well, notice how when I do that, now that material is something that's in my model, and I can go to Tools, Material Replacer, and I can click on this option or this material and then click on this material. And what that's going to do is that's going to swap out that old material with the new material right here. And so now let's say that we were to select this. Notice how this object allows us to not only adjust the normal, which makes it bumpier, it allows us to adjust the roughness, which gives it a sheen. Then there's also an option for an ambient occlusion map. So what an ambient occlusion map is it's a map that tells SketchUp to make crevices darker. So if you look at this kind of from the side right here, notice how if I bring it really far down, it doesn't really do that at all. But as I start bringing it up, it highlights the depth in here. So I really like materials with ambient occlusion maps because they do a great job of looking just a little bit more realistic. So now we need a brick material. And so in this case, we could pull a brick material out of the SketchUp library, right? There's a number of brick materials like this one right here. If I apply it to the surface, I could then use material replacer to swap out this material with this material like this. And so if I look at this material, I want to go into edit and I want to bring the normal on that brick up. I want to make sure the ambient occlusion is all the way on like this, but this gives me a much more realistic brick inside of my model, just like this. However, I don't want to use a material that's inside of the SketchUp library at all. I want to bring in an external material. So to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to a texture website. In this case, we're going to go to a website called POLYHAVEN.com. And there's a ton of these different places where you can download these, but we're going to go to Assets, Textures, and we're going to look for a brick material. And I want to pick something that's got a lot of really good kind of crevices in it. So this one might be good. That's a little old looking. I think we'll go with this brick wall 05 right here. Well, what we want to do is we want to download the material and the maps that we were talking about, right? Notice how this comes with your ambient occlusion map, it comes with your normal map, and it comes with your roughness map right here. And so what we want to do is we want to download those. And we're going to keep these fairly small. So we're just going to do a 2K material because the larger they get, the larger your file size is. But I'm just going to go to zip right here, and I'm going to select the ambient occlusion map, the diffuse map, which is the actual texture image that gets tiled. I want the normal, and I want the roughness. And so in this case, I'm going to pick the DX instead of the GL. It doesn't really matter. Just note which one you bring in, and we're going to click on download. So when we do that, that's going to download that to a folder on your computer that you can unzip. And so when you unzip that, you're going to have those map files inside of that folder. And we want to go ahead and we want to drop them in. So let's go back to SketchUp. And in this case, I want to go to Select, and I want to click the plus button to bring my own material in. And notice how this pops up a little box that allows me to set up a material. So in this case, I want to start by using a texture image. I'm going to go into this folder and I'm going to load the diffuse map in there like this. So now I've got a brick material. And what I want to do is I want to go down, I want to uncheck metalness because this isn't a metal material. And I want to load in the roughness map, the normal map. Notice that this is a DX. So this option right here allows you to flip if this is a DX or a GL normal. You just want to match that up to whatever your material says it's going to be. And we want to bring in the ambient occlusion map right here. And we're going to click on OK. Well, now what I'm going to do is first off, a lot of the time, because you can have a lot of materials in your model, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to name this something like AA underscore brick. Right here. So when I do that, these get sorted alphabetically, so it'll show up closer to the front of the list. But now I'm going to take that material, apply it to this surface, and then I'm going to replace the material with material replacer. So I'll replace this brick with this brick right here. Now, one thing you might notice is this material is really small. We need to bring this up to a real world size. So we're just going to go into Edit. We're going to adjust this to something like 5 foot by 5 foot. That's a little big, so maybe 3 foot by 3 foot works a little bit better, or 2 foot by 2 foot. And you just want to set this up so those bricks look like they're the real world size right here. And so for this object, I want to bring the roughness all the way up because I don't want this to be super reflective. You can play with your normal a little bit in order to make that brick look a little rougher. And I want the ambient occlusion all the way up at 1. And so you can go through and do this for all of the materials in your model, but I think you get the idea of what's going on. Well, now what I want to do is I want to look at my different images and see which ones look good with the lighting that we have associated with them. And a lot of the time, to make the materials look the best inside of SketchUp, what you do is you want to orient your scene where the sun is kind of in the back, where it's going to reflect directly to your camera angle. So you kind of want to set your sun up over here so that you're getting a better view of the way the light would bounce off of these materials right here. And so we might bring the sky dome exposure down. We might play with our reflections a little bit. We're going to go ahead and update this. And I just like to play around with a lot of the different backgrounds in here to see which ones are going to look really good versus the ones that are going to look kind of average, because some of them look good, some of them don't. So we might do something like this. And in this case, we might set this up where our camera's a little bit lower so we get a little bit more reflection in here. So I'm just going to play with my sky dome right here. We're going to adjust our brick size because this is still a little small for me. So I might call this 2 foot 6 inches, or we might go back to 3 foot right here. That looks pretty good. But now I think we're pretty close. The only other thing I might do is I might play around with the sun height a little bit. I like to cheat the sun height in here just a bit to get more dramatic shadows. So I'm going to play with where the sun is right here, like this. And I think we're going to call this pretty good. So once we're done, we're going to update our scene. And I always like to toggle back to that working view just to kind of remember what it looked like without those rendered materials, because it is a stark difference in here. But then once you're done with this material, what you can do is you can export this to a rendered image. So you can go to a File, Export, 2D Graphic, and you can go into your options and you can adjust things like your resolution. I usually keep this a little higher on the resolution end because I think it just looks a little bit better. And so we're going to go ahead and click on OK. We'll click on Export. So what that's going to do is that's going to export an image to your computer that you can then use for whatever. It's basically created an image. And so if I go in that folder and open up that image, you can see that your rendering is going to look something like this. So you can use this to add details to your SketchUp models in here really quickly. And so one of the other things that I'll do sometimes is when I pick things like the glass, I'll cheat a little bit and I'll bump their opacity up, but then I'll also bump their roughness way down and give it just a little bit more metalness. So depending on how you do this, the metalness can give you a little bit of extra reflection off of that glass with the background, just depending on what you're trying to do. So say that, for example, you picked one of the environments that has like trees in the background or something like that, like this one. So I'm gonna go ahead and set my sun location right here. But notice how that just gets me a little bit more reflection off of that glass right here. And the more opacity you have on the glass, the more reflection you're gonna get. So if I crank that opacity up even more, notice how I get more reflection right here, like this. So you can just use the combination of the metalness and the opacity in here in order to get a little bit of background or backdrop reflection on your images like this one. All right, so lots to cover in this video, but if you do have any questions about rendering in SketchUp 2025, feel free to leave them down below. I did a in-depth workshop in my course, so you might want to check that out as well. But if you have any questions, feel free to leave them down below and let me know. As always, thank you so much for taking the time to watch this, and I'll catch you in the next video. Thanks, guys.